What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have a lot to unpack today because Invest 90L, the first invest of the Atlantic hurricane season, has developed in the subtropical Atlantic. It has been tagged by the National Hurricane Center, and it's quickly organizing and has a pretty decent shot at development. Also watching a few other things as well, so let's go ahead and dive right into it. All right, so here's what we have in the National Hurricane Center right here. So we now have a 20% probability of development. This was tagged earlier this morning at a 10% probability of development, so now that has gone up. So here's the situation that we have. Satellite data indicate that a weak low pressure system has formed about 450 miles east-southeast of Bermuda. The associated showers and thunderstorms remain disorganized, but some slow development is possible during the next day or so while the low moves northeastward over the central Atlantic. By Monday night, however, the system is expected to move over cool waters and in a region of strong upper-level winds, ending its opportunity for development. 20% chance of formation in the next 48 hours and 20% in the next 7 days. So that's kind of the situation that we have right here. This has just popped up this morning, and like I said in the last few videos, unless we see something kind of unexpected happening in the last few days of June, we're probably not going to see development. Well, this might end up being something kind of unexpected because, at least for right now, it looks like it's trying to get its act together and at least get something done before it moves into a worse environment than it is right now. And we're going to dissect everything in just a second, but before we do that, we need to go to the Eastern Pacific and talk about the disturbance over there. A disorganized area of showers and thunderstorms is located a couple hundred miles offshore of Central America. An area of low pressure is forecast to develop from this system within the next day or two. Environmental conditions appear conducive for subsequent gradual development, and a tropical depression is likely to form by the middle of the week while the system moves west-northwestward across off the coast of Central America and southern Mexico. Locally heavy rainfall is possible across portions of Costa Rica and Nicaragua throughout the early part of this week. 10% probability of development in the next 48 hours, 70% probability in the next 7 days. So that's kind of what we have going on in the Eastern Pacific. So that's what we have from the National Hurricane Center. Let's go ahead and head back to satellite imagery. And let's go ahead and take a quick overview of both the areas of interest we're paying attention to, and then we'll get a closer look at both of them, starting with Invest 90L. This is where it's currently located, just north of the subtropical-tropical border right there. The borders at the area between the subtropical and tropical region is kind of cut off at 30 degrees north, so it's just north of that latitude right there, excuse me. And it's kind of trying to get its act together. You're seeing more convection starting to fire off near the center, at least of where the yellow X is right here. And then in terms of what we're looking at over here in the Eastern Pacific, you're seeing more disorganized convection firing off. Going to want to keep an eye on that as well. Let's go ahead and zoom into Invest 90L. So here's what we have going on. We're seeing more convection starting to organize and fire off a little bit. It's not particularly that impressive right now compared to like a bunch of other areas of convection that I've seen with other tropical cyclones. But given that this is mid to late June and the system's trying to get its act together and it already has a pretty decent outflow boundary affiliated with it, it's definitely doing its thing and it's definitely trying to organize very quickly before it moves into a more unfavorable environment. So that's something you're going to want to pay attention to. And I know earlier Charlie sent me this ASCAT data right here for 90L right here. This is the ASCAT data they found. They found a didn't exactly find a closed low just yet, but they did find a low that's trying to close off pretty quickly in that convection. Although the center of circulation is a bit elongated from that convection, so you're going to want to watch and see how this will ultimately pan out. But going back to satellite, you're starting to see more bands trying to develop. You're noticing more convection trying to fire off a little bit. It's not particularly that concentrated just yet, but give it some time and it ultimately will at least have some semblance of a tropical system potentially organizing. Looking at water vapor imagery, zooming out on this a little bit. Where it's at right now, it's actually in a pocket of moist air right now, and that outflow boundary that's kind of starting to develop, that's kind of moving into this region right here. It's kind of clashing a little bit with this area. That's actually going to help potentially breathe some new life into this system. So you're going to want to watch and see how this will pan out right here. But yes, there is a dry slot just to its south right there, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's in a pocket of relatively moist air, and regardless of what happens in the next 24 hours, it is in a relatively good environment for development, so you're going to want to pay very close attention to that. Now, is it going to affect anywhere in land? No, but does it have a chance to potentially become our first tropical depression or our first named storm? Absolutely, it does. So you're going to want to see how this will pan out, especially with how quickly it's evolving right here. Now let's go ahead and shift over just a little bit to the Eastern Pacific, do a quick rundown over there. Okay, not the Eastern Atlantic, Eastern Pacific, but here's what we have for the Eastern Pacific right here. You're noticing all this convection starting to organize and potentially develop. It's going to take its time. It's going to take a few days for it to fully grasp and fully start to organize, but you are noticing a lot of that convection, a lot of that moisture, and that tropical wave in general is moving into the region right there. It's actually in a relatively favorable area for development right here. First of all, looking at the moisture, where's the dry air? Well over here. It's going to be a multi-day event where it's going to kind of organize, develop, and it's going to hang around for multiple days. It's not going to be one of those spin-ups where it just gets really intense really fast and then it just dissipates. No, it's going to stay around for a few days. Intensity-wise, we'll have to see what happens, and we'll look at some model runs in a little bit to kind of indicate that. But ultimately, the situation we have right there isn't particularly that bad, and we do have some good conditions for development over there. Now let's go ahead and take a quick look at some model runs very quickly, just so that way we can kind of take a look and we can kind of see what are the models picking up on, and is this system developing fast enough, at least in the subtropics, or too fast for the models to pick up on. So here's what we have for the European. The European does have something trying to develop over here. It does have a closed off low pressure system with this area of interest right there, and it actually is closed off for quite some time, at least for the next 3 days, which is pretty interesting, but it doesn't have a low meter tagged or anything like that, so you're going to want to watch and see how that'll pan out. Personally, I don't think models are going to help too much with Invest 90L, mainly because of how quickly it's organizing and kind of how caught off guard these models have been with that, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. But in terms of what's going on in the Eastern Pacific, what we're looking at, you're slowly seeing the system organizing and developing in the next 3 days. It's kind of going to take its time. It's not going to really be that strong initially. We're at 1,007, 1,009 millibars, and then it starts to organize a bit more. Now you're starting to notice this area is actually starting to wrap around a bit more. Actually, let me go ahead and get back to it. You're starting to notice those isobars starting to tighten up a little bit over there. Pressure gradient starting to tighten up. It gets down to 999 millibars over here, but then it starts to interact with worse conditions, weakens, and that's pretty much the last we'll hear of that from the European. That's kind of a bit of a downtrend I've noticed in terms of its intensity right there. Before it was calling for a hurricane type system, and now it's calling for like a tropical storm at most. So that's kind of interesting. We'll have to see what happens with that. Looking at the GFS run, we'll use the 0Z for this exercise. 0Z, and pretty interesting, organizing and developing, having the system pretty strengthen quickly, then weaken, and then it does a few other things, and that's pretty much where we're at. I'm not even going to pay attention to the 0Z run. Let's go ahead and go to the 12Z run just to kind of show this, as well as the other subtropical system that we're watching. So in terms of what we're seeing in the Atlantic, you are noticing the GFS starting to pick up on it, seeing those isobars, seeing a closed off low right there. But ultimately, it looks like the GFS hasn't really picked up on it either. And like I said, the models are probably not going to pick up on this too much right away, mainly because of how quickly this is developing. So we'll have to pay attention going forward. But ultimately, what you're looking at in the Eastern Pacific, systems organizing, developing, strengthens to near hurricane strength, then it starts to hug the coast, and it kind of just hovers from there going forward. So that's kind of your situation that you're dealing with right there from the GFS. Now looking at the Canadian run, seeing if the Canadian's actually picking up on this a little bit, but it's still a closed low, not really organized that much, so we'll have to see what happens. with that. But in terms of the Eastern Pacific, system organizes, develops, hugs the coast. That's pretty much where we're at right now. So it's a bit of a shift, as before we were seeing this system moving further away from land, and now we're seeing the system from these new model runs moving closer and closer towards land. So we're going to want to pay attention to that. We're going to want to see how this will ultimately pan out and how things will go over there. Last look at the icon. Icon doesn't really show this system really in the Atlantic either. It's mainly because of how quickly it's developing. And then you have this system over here in the Eastern Pacific, not really that strong either. So we're going to have to watch these trends and see what's going on. Now let's go ahead and zone in on Invest 90L, as well as maybe some other tropical conditions that we're paying attention to, and go, okay, 90L has a shot. But how big is that shot really? Because the NHC is only having it a 20% probability, but those odds are increasing by the hour. So I want to see just how much time does it have before it moves into unfavorable conditions. Starting with the sea surface temperatures, here's where we're at right now. Basically, this whole area of warm water that really moved in here in the last 2 weeks, this has become kind of a godsend for Invest 90L, because now it has a lot warmer water to work with than we did a couple of weeks ago. We were at like 27 degrees Celsius in this area right here. Now we're at like 28, 29 degrees Celsius in a lot of these areas. So those increases in water temperatures have really helped allow for a more tropical development potential to happen in this area. In fact, where it's at right now, it's in an area of about 28 degrees Celsius, 27 degrees Celsius, I'd say, which is about 80.6 to 82.4 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you tuning into the United States. So it has plenty of warm water to work with, but as it's moving out, once it gets past this 26-degree contour right here, it's going to be moving into a worse environment, and I would say by the time it gets to like 35 degrees north, that's when tropical development chances shut down, and that's kind of when I'd say, okay, all bets are off, it's not going to happen, but it has time to do that. It has time for over water, and it has time over a low wind shear pocket, which we will get into in just a second. Looking at the OHC, for that region, let's go ahead and take a quick gander at that. Here's the OHC for today. Where it's at right now, it's not particularly in an impressive area of ocean heat content. It's in an area of about roughly, I'd say, 25-ish max OHC. So the water temperatures where it's at currently, like the warm waters, I'd say, they're very surface-based and they're very shallow. They're not going that deep into the water right there. They're not going too deep. This is a type of system, though, where it doesn't need deep warm water. It just needs surface warm water because of how quickly it's moving and because of just the amount of time it has over these conditions to allow for development. So that's kind of what we're looking at right there. Elsewhere in the Atlantic, you're noticing more OHC starting to fire off in the Gulf. Heck, I've noticed this too. You're noticing more OHC in the Eastern Gulf as well. Before, you weren't seeing too much of that. Now, over the last week or so, you've seen more of it fire off over here. In fact, from June 1st, we went from pretty much from here to here around the Gulf region right here. And before, it was a pretty big increase in the western half of the Gulf and not so much in the eastern half, with the exception of the loop current. Now, you're looking at a pretty big jump over here as well. I don't know what this pocket of low OHC is right here. I'm not sure if it's a glitch or if it's kind of like a bug or something like that. We'll have to pay attention to it. But looking at what we're seeing now with the OHC in parts of the loop current, we're close to cracking 175 OHC in that tiny area right there. So that's a factor to pay attention to. Also, noticing the OHC in the northwestern Caribbean is becoming a lot more concentrated as well. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. You're noticing that OHC starting to bubble up, and you're seeing a more concentrated area of that. That's going to be important for as we get into July, as we get into August, all of those months as well, especially September and even October as well. So that's another factor you're going to want to pay attention to. And elsewhere around the main development region, it's still moving a bit further to the north, but you are noticing some increases of OHC regardless. Now to the jugular. Let's go ahead and get to the wind shear. First the wind shear map, and then the wind shear the wind shear forecast. Wind shear map, where this is at right now, where this tropical wave is currently. It's currently, I believe, this line of convection right here, and it's over an area of about 10, 15, isolated area of 20 knots, but that can be attributed to the system itself. But right now, it's over an area of like 10 to 15 knots of wind shear. So it's actually in a pretty good pocket of low wind shear. And yes, you have this wind shear that's going to be moving into the region a little bit later. That's cracking 30 to 40 knots or so. But that's going to take about a day or so for that to happen. And that's something that we will pay attention to. But by and large, until it gets to that shear, it has a good shot of development. It also has some pretty good vorticity with it as well. So we'll have to see how this pans out. Let's go ahead now and move over to the wind shear forecast just very quickly, and then we'll get to the moisture and kind of see, okay, how is this going to pan out exactly? Let's go ahead and look at 250 millibar wind shear. Wind shear, where this system is at right now, it's in that pocket of low wind shear, but it is expected to start crashing into that higher area of wind shear right here, and then another even larger area of wind shear as that trough starts to dig down into that region. It's going to crash into it and really kill any chance of development in the next 48 hours or so. So that's something you're going to want to pay attention to right here as more wind shear does start to move into the subtropical Atlantic. In the tropical Atlantic, you're noticing a wind shear collapse in parts of the main development region. We've talked about this. And then you're noticing a more wavy pattern with this right here. You're starting to notice how quickly it goes from this, like where it's more concentrated, to when it's going up and down, fluctuating all over the place as we get into July. So that's a factor that you're going to want to pay attention to if you are watching from the Lesser Antilles, the Greater Antilles, and in the Caribbean, because that could potentially pose more tropical opening threats, I would say, for parts of July, because last year we didn't see any development in July, mainly because the Sahara air layer and wind shear was kind of not cooperating as much. But ultimately, what you're seeing now is you're seeing the wind shear forecasts really start to collapse quite a bit as we get into the first days of July. So that's something you're going to want to stay tuned for and something you're going to want to pay attention to. Now let's go ahead and wrap this up with the moisture component. Where is 90L at right now? Currently, it's actually in like I said, in a pocket of pretty moist air right now, and that's not going to be a big problem. Yes, there will be a little bit of dry air that may penetrate it as well, but that's not going to happen until about I'd say like tomorrow night or into early Tuesday. Then after that, I don't see any signs of this developing. But after that, and taking a look at more of the tropical regions right here, what you're noticing here, yes, you're having more Sahara air, and then you're noticing some more moisture coming into parts of the main development region as more tropical waves and as more monsoons start to ramp up in Africa right here. Yes, you're still going to see more of a burst of Sahara dust, but looking around July 4th, July 5th, July 6th, this far out, you're noticing a bit of a surge compared to what we were seeing previously. You're looking at the precipitable water anomalies. You're seeing a bigger moisture surge, at least in terms of area, compared to what we were seeing previously. So that's something to pay attention to. You're noticing these drier anomalies starting to decrease in the main development region. Yes, there is some, of course, in that moves through parts of the Caribbean right here. That's Sahara air layer, ladies and gentlemen. That's not going to really trigger any tropical development for quite a while. But I would say, starting to look at July, though, and as we continue to get more data further into early July, you're looking at a few more potential areas and a few more potential signs of development going forward. So that's the situation that we're dealing with right here, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. Before I end, I do want to say we are going to be streaming tonight starting at 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, when the next NHC advisory for 90L comes out. Man, it's a good thing I delayed the stream a day, because now we have an area of interest that's been tagged, and we can talk about that a little bit, as well as some other conditions that we're paying attention to. So we'll have a bit more of an quote-unquote exciting stream tonight for you guys. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and close the video out right here. I really hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. We also hit 12,000 subscribers yesterday. Thank you very much for the 12,000 subs. Let's try to get to 13,000 before my birthday. I would really appreciate that. That is July 17th. Let's see if we can do that. But as always, if you want to help out, hang out, or ask us questions, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. stay safe.